Hi there. Today I would like to discuss the increasingly common occurrence of Christianity becoming a form of idolatry. Now, in some sense, this is almost unimaginably important because it speaks to a critical failure in the way that a huge portion of humanity has been thinking over the last several hundred years. Now, what's also interesting about this is that what we'll discuss also seems to indicate that a huge portion of Christians and a huge portion of atheists have actually been making the same intellectual mistake, but it's just being manifested in two different ways. And of course, this is wildly juicy because typically we think of Christianity and atheism as being two different things that are, in some sense, diametrically opposed. And so that'll be a very interesting thing to unpack. Okay, so before we actually go through Christianity and idolatry, in order to properly motivate that, we have to discuss two other things first. First, we have to discuss the origin of the religious impulse, and we also have to discuss the insufficiency of language in describing reality. Okay, so what do I mean when I say the origin of the religious impulse? Well, this is essentially a question of where does religion even come from in the first place? I mean, we see that religion is something that has arisen cross-culturally and is by no means something that has happened in one particular place and is an isolated, arbitrary thing. And so this immediately begs the question, why do humans have a tendency to practice religion? Okay, so to get to an answer to this question, I think it'd probably be best to first ask a couple questions about what your mind is doing in any given moment. And so my first question to you is, how does your mind determine what to do next in any given moment? So for instance, even if you're lying on your bed, your brain is basically making the decision to continue lying on your bed instead of getting up and doing something else in that particular moment. So how is that happening? Well, in some sense, it seems like the brain is constantly presenting itself with a wide variety of different possibilities that it could pursue. In this particular context, one of the possibilities is continuing to lie in bed, and one of the other possibilities is getting up and doing some particular chore. And so, in some sense, there's this notion of many different possibilities and the brain selecting one. Well, but that's interesting because that immediately begs a further question, which is, how does the brain choose between the many different options? And in order to answer this, I'm going to give another example. So let's say that it's dinner time and you're hungry. Now, two things that are within the realm of possibility for you is you could either get up, go make yourself dinner, and eat dinner, or you could also get up and go on a 20-mile run. Now, for most of us, the decision there is clear. We want to get up and go make ourselves dinner and satiate our hunger. But the question is why? Well, in some sense, we have this deep implied sense of an ideal state of being that we're constantly seem to evaluate our the different possibilities that our brain presents against. So for example, part of this ideal seems to be a state where you are no longer hungry. And so your brain is basically using this as a metric to determine which of the states will lead to that desired outcome, this more optimal outcome. Now, this is very important because this sense of the ideal state or this sense of the optimal state is actually very deeply subconscious within us. And in some situations can be a very difficult thing to describe, but nonetheless seems to be something that is deep within us and orients our decisions. Now, this is actually, I would say, a sufficient framework for understanding the religious impulse. And in order to see this, let's look at something like Greek mythology. So in Greek mythology, you basically have a bunch of different deities for a variety of different things. You have a goddess of the harvest, you have a god of the sun, you have a goddess of the moon, you have a god of death, all of these different things. Well, what's actually happening there? So in some sense, you could say that basically for the Greeks there, and also for the other different people groups around the world who did something analogous, what's actually happening there is that the objects of the religion they're worshiping or the religion they're practicing are basically a mechanism for orienting the individual and collective attention towards different aspects of reality that hold some degree of value or hold some degree of importance to these people. So I think a very good example of this is the harvest god. Now, in some sense, planting crops and harvesting crops is something that takes a lot of planning, a lot of collective effort. And so in that particular sense, religion is actually genius because it basically provides a mechanism for helping everyone to orient their attention on the same goal. And in some sense, you could ask the question of what would happen if that wasn't the case. And if that wasn't the case, then you potentially just have a bunch of people bumbling around, pursuing their own small desires, not really getting much done. I mean, this is essentially the difference between pursuing instant gratification and delayed gratification. And in some sense, there's a question of how could humanity even discover delayed gratification in the first place? And in some sense, it seems that humanity partially discovered this through the religious impulse, through this impulse to orient themselves towards orient themselves and other people towards the things of greatest value in order to actually bring about that more ideal state. Okay, so again, I think I'll just say this one more time because this is so important. Once again, it seems like the religious impulse is a desire to orient the individual and collective attention around different aspects of reality that have the greatest degree of value, or in some sense, allow humanity to move closer towards the ideal state of being. Okay, so now that we have that kind of out of the way, let's now discuss language. So let me ask you a very, very simple question here. What is a cup? Now, of course, in some sense, you know what a cup is. You might even have one in front of you. But if you think about it, it's actually a little bit difficult to try to come up with a very precise definition of what a cup is. And to motivate why that is, a cup might be something that's made of wood. It might be something that's made of plastic. It might be something that's made of metal. Cups can come in many different sizes. Cups can have a handle, they can have a lid, or they might not have either of those. So in some sense, there is no necessarily fixed object within a reality that corresponds directly with what a cup is. And in some sense, by generally morphing this idea of a cup, there are essentially an infinite number of things that correspond to the word cup. So what are we actually referring to when we say cup? And as you might imagine, the answer to this seems to be something like a cup is a thing that we use to drink liquid. Okay, and obviously we could probably get a little bit more precise. We could be more precise in order to distinguish between a cup and a bottle, for example. But I think you get the point I'm saying. But this is actually interesting because it speaks to a potential failure in the way that we think of language. So, for example, I should say this is also how I used to think of language. I used to think that language, the purpose of language was an attempt to describe reality as much as possible. But if we take the cup example and basically you can apply this to almost everything else that you use language for. Language is actually providing a mechanism for you to ignore almost all of reality except for one particular thing that has some degree of value to you. Now that's very interesting. And you also might ask the question, like, why would you even do this? Well, in some sense, as indicated, reality is almost everything, well, basically everything within reality is infinitely complex. There's literally too much happening in reality to pay attention to everything at once. And so, in some sense, we need a mechanism for being able to focus on the things that are most important to us. And in some sense, language provides that sort of mechanism. Now, if you're hearing what I'm saying, you probably have realized that the way I'm discussing language is also almost exactly the same way that I was discussing religion as well. And I would totally agree. It seems like the deeper reason behind why we have language and the deeper reason for the origin of the religious impulse seem to be coming from the exact same thing, which is just a matter of attempting to orient attention towards that which has value or towards an ideal state of, or some ideal state that is worth pursuing. And so that's fascinating. Okay, so one more thing that I think I would like to talk about before we move on to Christianity and idolatry is, while we said that for most things that are happening within reality, our language is basically a mechanism to ignore almost everything that's happening with reality except for one very narrow particular thing. But there actually is something that we have a very strong incentive to understand as best as possible. And that thing is the implied ideal itself. This thing within us that in some sense our subconscious is using to orient all of our decisions. And why would we want to understand this as well as possible? Well, almost by definition, the closer you can align yourself towards that ideal, by definition, the better off you'll be because you're closer towards the ideal state of being. And so, again, you have an incentive to essentially never stop trying to understand that particular thing in as much detail. And insofar as basically everything is almost infinitely complex, so, in some sense, so is that ideal state. And so there's always in some sense work to be done in moving closer towards that almost perfect ideal state for what you could become. Okay, so also keep that in your back pocket because I think that'll be very, very interesting or very, very important in our discussion of Christianity and idolatry and what is to come. Okay, so now that we have discussed the nature of the origin of the religious impulse and we've discussed language a bit, now let's actually move on to let's move on to Christianity and idolatry. Okay, so now probably a first very reasonable question is, why should we even consider Christianity at all? Why is Christianity important? Who cares if there is some God floating around in the sky? Or who cares if a bunch of people are making the assertion that there is some God floating around the sky? Well, okay, fair enough, but in some sense, it's indisputable that Christianity has been wildly popular. And so, regardless of your actual belief system, a very, very interesting question, a very, very natural, interesting question is to wonder, what is it about Christianity that has so fundamentally captured the attention of billions of people throughout history? And that's an interesting question. And so let's try to unpack that. Let's try to understand that. And I think in order to understand that, we, as you might expect, need to understand the different parts of Christianity. So I think the first thing that we should look at, which is in some sense one of the most, if not the most important aspect of Christianity, is the Christian conception of God himself, this notion of God that's put forward by the Bible. And so for that, again, we can ask the question, coming from like a somewhat agnostic perspective, what do Christians mean when they say God? Not what is God, because that sort of question ends up being something that's totally subjective. We're trying to ask the question of, what do Christians mean when they say God? Okay, so that's particularly interesting. And so in order to try to answer that question, let's maybe discuss some of the different ways that God is described within the context of the Bible. And hopefully that can lead us closer towards a better understanding of, again, what Christians mean when they say this. Okay, so some of the adjectives and some of the phrases that are used to describe God throughout the Bible is this notion of a King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There's this notion of God is perfect. There's this notion of God is omnipotent. He is all-knowing, all-seeing, everywhere, all-powerful. And also there's this notion of God being perfect in his love for us. So it's this like supremely perfect entity. So within the framework that we had used to describe the religious impulse, this notion of there basically being an ideal that humanity is attempting to pursue, it would seem that the God that is presented in the Christian framework is essentially the highest, most supreme ideal that could possibly be something that we pursue. It is the greatest good. It is the highest thing that is worth pursuing, which is really, really quite interesting. And actually, if you think about God in that particular respect, other aspects of Christianity actually start making a lot more sense. And just to give this is something that I would like to explore much more in other videos. But to give you just a little taste, let's look at the idea of sin. Now, sin has been something that has been shall we say, very, very irritating for me throughout my life, because it's essentially been a mechanism of just intense guilt and shame about things that seemed arbitrary to me. And I think this has also been the experience of a lot of people. But if you look at God as this notion of the supreme, best, ultimate fulfillment of what reality could be, what is the Bible saying sin is? The Bible is essentially asserting that sin is anything that keeps you away from achieving that ultimate fulfillment of not only your life, but also reality. So in some sense, sin is not this just container of guilt and shame. Sin is quite literally a tragedy, because it is anything that keeps you from quite literally being your best self, fulfilling the ultimate ideal of what you could be, which again is a tragedy. It's not something to beat someone's head over. It's something that we would very naturally want. Insofar as you want the best for yourself, it's something that you would want to put away, but is still prevalent in your life. And in some sense, as I kind of indicated, this realization has been very helpful for me, because I think I had a very warped perception of what sin is growing up. And as you may assume, I had grown up in a somewhat Christian context, which is part of the reason why I care about this so much. I'll talk a little bit more later about my particular experience in a bit. Now, okay, before we move on to idolatry, you might be asking the question, when are we going to talk about Jesus? I mean, Jesus is, in some sense, one of the most important, or if not, again, this notion of God and Jesus, the most important aspect of Christianity, especially in distinguishing Christianity between something like Judaism. Okay, and Jesus, this notion of Jesus, or what people are trying to describe when they say Jesus, is actually quite interesting as well, and in some sense makes some very, very powerful claims about the nature of reality. However, I think I'm going to leave that for a future video, because it actually isn't as important for the present discussion, and it warrants a much broader discussion. I think for the time being, what I'll say is this notion of Jesus is essentially put forward by the Bible as being an answer to essentially your quote-unquote sins keeping you from quote-unquote God. Again, using sin and God in the symbolic sense that I had developed just a little bit earlier that we had been using. Okay, so again, I think that's all I'll say about Jesus for the present context. Okay, so now that we've kind of discussed Christianity in some sense, now let's move on to this notion of idolatry. So based on how we have described God, what does idolatry even mean? Like what is idolatry attempting to describe? The best way to see this is to look at the first two of the 10 commandments. Now, the first commandment is essentially saying, you shall have no other little g gods above me, big G God. Now, the second commandment is saying, you shall not make for yourself idols and worship them. So what are those things saying? Well, insofar as God is identified with this greatest and most supreme ideal that is possible within reality, then this actually makes a lot of sense. This is essentially making the assertion of don't aim lower. Do not aim lower than that which is the highest, most glorious fulfillment of that which reality is. Like by aiming lower, you are doing yourself and everyone else a disservice in that particular capacity, which is very interesting. And also that would immediately beg the question of why would someone do that? Why wouldn't someone strive to pursue the greatest and best of what they have? And maybe a different way of asking this is, what does idolatry look like for someone who believes they're doing it rationally? Well, in some sense, I would think that this is most naturally manifest when someone believes that they have found definitively something within the context of reality that is the ideal. Essentially confusing something finite, some finite aspect of reality, for this infinitely complex ideal that actually, in some sense, is God, or is, again, to describe that as the supreme ideal, I think is actually better because you're not being weighed down by connotations. Okay, so again, this kind of begs the question of if there is this notion of the highest ideal that is worth pursuing, why wouldn't someone pursue that? Why on earth would anyone not do that? And I think this is actually like a very, very good question. And I think that there are kind of two main reasons for this. I think the first is essentially making a mistake of ignorance, and I think the second is essentially a mistake of fear. And so, in some sense, if we describe ignorance in this context, it actually makes sense if you just don't realize that there is actually something greater worth pursuing, and you settle for something less, and you just don't have a realization of that. You're essentially practicing idolatry out of a place of ignorance of God in some particular capacity. And honestly, that seems forgivable. It's like, how could you possibly know the supreme ideal if you aren't aware of it? And I'm not sure how much we could say that actually occurs, because there really does seem to be something deep within us that's constantly drawing us towards something greater and something more. But that being said, I think that's still a reasonable way of understanding how someone could arrive at something like idolatry. Now, I think the other thing that is much more interesting is this idea of fear. So insofar as reality is unbelievably or almost infinitely complex, and in some sense, because the ideal is something that is deeply tied with reality itself, there's, in some sense, this ideal defies description. This ideal cannot be properly understood in a set of finite propositions or a set of finite language. And so if that's the case, that begs the question, does it actually even exist? Is there actually a supreme ideal that we ought to orient ourselves towards that brings about continual goodness and continual renewal? And that's a very legitimate concern. I mean, let's imagine that you had found something within reality that you found to be particularly fulfilling, or maybe at least partially fulfilling, partially good. It would take in some sense, a supreme act of courage in order to throw that thing away because you believe that there is something that you don't know at the time within the context of reality that is greater than the thing that you're holding on to in that moment. And in some sense, that is the belief in God. That you, by believing in God, you are believing that there is this continual ideal that can be continually pursued and allows for continual redemption. It's something that's beyond just the finite nature of the things that we can contain within the context of our lives. And so that's incredibly powerful. And also, I should say, that is a non-trivial thing to believe. That is a difficult thing to believe, and I think extremely difficult even to our souls. And so to say that you would be afraid of abandoning that which you have in order for that which you dream, that's a hard thing to do. That is a wildly hard thing to do. Okay, so now with that out of the way, you might very reasonably ask the question of what are some examples of idolatry that are present in our culture. You could be asking me, within a biblical context, weren't idols just these small carvings? Weren't they just these small statues and carvings that people would worship, that people would orient themselves towards? And in some sense, the answer to that question is yes. However, within the context of what we've been discussing so far, and within the context of the definitions we've been using, I would say that there are actually many different things within our present reality that definitely, indisputably, take the form of idols. And we'll be getting to a big one, which you may be looking forward to in a second. But I think I'll give maybe two main examples of certain idols that I see that are very prevalent in our culture. And I think these are obvious. These are things that I think you'll agree with. Now, the first one is essentially the life of the rich and famous. This is something that captures the attention of like millions of people. It's something that almost everyone over and over again wants to pursue and attain. But the thing that's wild about this, and the thing that just doesn't seem to be learned, is that if you actually look at these celebrities who have attained the life of the rich and famous, so many of them are in a state of utter desolation because they have no idea where to go next. They have effectively lost their compass that is orienting them towards the greater ideal. And so in that state, that's a state of utter desolation. And that's the aspect of reality that it seems like so many people don't see. And so within that particular context, this notion of pursuing the life of the rich and famous seems to fit almost perfectly within the definition of of an idol as we have presented it so far. Okay, so I think another second example that I think I would like to bring up is this notion of ideology, which is effectively idolatry, or is effectively intellectual idolatry, where you basically take one narrow particular intellectual idea and essentially strive after that as though it is the ultimate ideal of reality. And I think you see this with basically all of the different words that end with ism. Like you could say, for example, environmentalism and feminism. And of course, for those things do talk about things that are actually very important. The issue becomes when you ascribe those things as having ultimate importance. And in some sense, you could basically ask the same question of those particular things as you could ask with the life of the rich and famous. So let's say that you have a particular feminist and she has her particular, or she or he has her particular set of things that they want to attain. What happens after they've attained those? What do they do next? If attaining those things is actually the ultimate ideal that is to be attained, where will they go next? And so in some sense, you could very easily predict that they would fall into the same the same degree of desolation that they experienced, or that these celebrities experience who made their billions and have no idea what to do next. Okay, so those are two particularly interesting examples. Okay, now I think we're finally in a position to like actually go for the jugular. And in some sense, that is this notion of maybe the most, or one of the most intellectually ironic things that has happened within the last several hundred years, is that Christianity, which is essentially preaching against idolatry, so many different modern manifestations of Christianity seem to be blatantly idolatrous, which is wild. But anyway, let's try to unpack that. So at a very high level, what do I mean by that? What does it look like for someone to make Christianity into an idol? Well, I think what it looks like is when people essentially worship the different aspects of the Christian story instead of striving to pursue the different aspects and ideals of reality that Christianity attempts to describe. Okay, so you might very well ask for different examples of this. And I think I'll give you two kind of what I'll call quote-unquote institutional examples, things that are happening that are on a more institutional level. And I'll also give you an example of one that is a bit more informal, that happens as I've seen more in the dialogue between different people. Okay, so the first kind of institutional example of Christianity as idolatry that I would say that is very prevalent is this notion of fundamentalism. And if you're not familiar, basically and also I should say fundamentalism is something that applies to almost any religion that has a religious text. And so you can get fundamentalism in a wide variety of religions. But within the Christian context, what fundamentalists assert is that every single thing that is within the Bible is literally true. It's almost like the content of the Bible is to be taken as the axiomatic framework for what reality is. Now, as you might expect, and as our discussion would indicate, this seems to present all number of huge issues. Well, in some sense, you're trying to describe something infinite like our reality with a finite set of things, and so you've almost already failed before you've started. Now, another really big issue here is that when you make the assertion that the content of the Bible is just axiomatically true without anything else being true, then you've essentially reduced the Bible to a set of seemingly like arbitrary propositions, and then in some sense you're not in an intellectual place to basically assert that your particular set of propositions is any better than anyone else's particular set of propositions. I suppose you could make a claim that the life that comes from this set of propositions is better, but still there's something very deep within us that just rejects things that seem to be totally arbitrary and just wants to do away with them altogether. It's the exact same impulse. It's the exact same thing as the religious impulse or this impulse of language. We're trying to ignore the aspects of reality that are not important and focus on the things that are important. And so things that are arbitrary seem to be by definition not important to us. So that's where you get this almost a strong repulsion to these fundamentalists. Okay, so the second institutional kind of example that I would like to give is something that I call pastoral totalitarianism, which is essentially when you have one particular person who has attained some degree of power in a Christian context, essentially asserting that all of his or her subordinates or congregation need to take on their particular interpretation of Christianity simply because they said so. And if you're in a Christian context, you probably know people for who this has been their experience in the church. And I mean, in my particular context, I have two friends who recently went through this with their church, and they had a massive falling out that was really immensely painful for both of them. And so it's again very, very tragic. This is not something to be minimized here. But again, you're dealing with the same case of basically someone saying, here are an arbitrary set of things which you have to believe are true simply on my authority. And that immediately begs the question, what if you're wrong? And in some sense, because reality is too complex to be described in language, in some sense you are necessarily wrong. Your interpretation is necessarily not sufficient in order to actually describe the totality of reality. And so what do you do in this context? You're saying I'm totally right, accept this, but also I can't actually be right. There's just a massive disconnect there. Okay, so the final example of what I would say of kind of Christianity seem to be this form of idolatry is very prevalent in, frankly, what I've seen the way that many Christians talk to each other. There's seemingly this constant use of like different slogans. There's a finite set of different slogans and different phrases that people constantly parrot to each other. This notion of the hedge of protection, this notion of the Prince of Peace, or Jesus died for your sins, or he walked on water, or he turned the five loaves into 5,000s. This is something that has taken on some degree of symbolic significance to the group of Christians, but from the outside, this once again, just like these other things, just looks like a set of arbitrary things that if a Christian is trying to convert someone else, it looks like the Christian is essentially just trying to get someone else to just believe in this set of arbitrary things. Okay, so with that said, you might be very understandably asking the question of why I even care about this at all. And so just a little bit about my backstory. I was very seriously Christian for the first 20 years of my life, even though I would say that the version of Christianity that I was worshiping was in some sense very naive. And then for the last 2 years, I've been basically explicitly atheist. And to make a very long story short, after the end of that interval, I essentially came to a place of feeling like the Christianity that I worshipped and the atheism that I had been ascribing to were both seemingly insufficient in the same way, which in some sense is why I'm even here and making this video in the first place. And something else that I found to be very interesting is that when I did kind of, when I made an effort to attempt to expand my imagination of what Christianity is, and I tried to kind of re-dip my toes into different Christian contexts, some particular church groups would be utterly repulsive to me. Or I would say actually most Christian contexts would be just utterly repulsive. It was almost like a feeling of disgust. I just had to be like away from them. Or in some sense, it was the most fulfilling, some of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. And it seemed to all hinge on whether or not you basically had these Christians practice, like in some sense, practicing idolatry. Because in one sense, you just have a bunch of Christians just parroting slogans, and it just seemed arbitrary and just something that like my entire being wanted to reject. But then in different times, you have people who are genuinely coming from places of legitimate brokenness, and there is actually something to be found within Christianity that they truly, fully believe saved them. And that's so interesting. That's so fascinating. That's where we get to this question of what is it about Christianity that has so fundamentally captured the human attention? And it's like, tell me more about that. Like, tell me, because in some sense, that's allowing me to ask the question, like, tell me more about what human existence is. And that's so fascinating. So, okay, in any respect, I think we're finally in a position to go back to one of the very first things that I had said in this video altogether, which is that it seems that both Christians and atheists seem to be, or I shouldn't say, a huge number of Christians and a huge number of atheists seem to be making the same intellectual mistake in their particular pursuit. And I would say the mistake there is basically viewing religion as a thing that can be distilled down to a finite number of propositions. Because if that is true, you eventually get to a place where you either need to basically accept those propositions or reject those propositions, which is essentially the distinction between Christians and atheists. Now, if you look at the atheists, or if you look at both of these groups, it's almost like, how could you possibly blame either of them? If you look at the atheists are just basically saying, I'm just not going to accept things that seem literally insane. And the Christians have to understand that so many of the things that they are saying are, at the very least, to be very courteous, these are things that don't typically occur in everyday life. People don't typically rise from the dead. People don't typically walk on water. And so atheists are like, no, I'm not just going to believe that someone walked on water. I'm not just going to believe that someone raised from the dead. I've never seen anything like that, and I've never seen any indication that something like that could happen. So in some sense, that feels rational. Now, from the Christian perspective, it's almost like the exact opposite. The Christians are basically saying, well, if you look at your own lives, there seems to be something deeply missing from that. And so basically, in an attempt to revive a sense of hope and purpose and direction, Christians are essentially, in some sense, taking a leap of faith in accepting this particular set of propositions in the belief that something may come of it. And the thing that's really wild is that for a lot of these people, there can actually be a genuine renewal of new life and just a lot of newness that can come from that pursuit. Okay, however, as you might expect, basically my response to this is that religion shouldn't and can't be, almost definitely, like if you just look at how complex reality is, religion can't be something that just can be distilled down to a finite set of propositions. There are so many, in some sense, as we described within the context of language, the purpose of language isn't even to attempt to describe everything that is happening with reality. Like, so much of what it's doing is helping us ignore most of what's happening in reality in order to only pursue the things of value. So in some sense, to the atheists, I would say, okay, it seems like what you're doing is, atheism seems to be a stance of rejecting a God that can be distilled down to a set of finite propositions, as we've said. And to that I would say, great, okay. But to them, I would say that my recommendation would be to release the shackles of finite propositions and actually look towards the aspects of reality that defy explanation, but in some sense seem to be the things that fundamentally capture the human imagination and bring about joy, life, and meaning within the context of life. And okay, to the Christians, I would say, insofar as you actually believe in the meta-existence of this supreme ideal that you call God, what I would say is worship God. Don't worship Christianity. So, okay, maybe another slightly funny way of saying this is, if you are actually a Christian, you actually believe these things, and you actually believe in the validity of the Ten Commandments, you actually believe that there should be no other little g gods above big G God, you believe that you should not worship idols, then in some sense, one of the most Christian things that you could do is to strive to move beyond that which you believe Christianity is. Okay. I think that's where I will end this present discussion. As you can probably tell, I am quite interested and quite, shall we say, passionate about this particular topic, and so I fully intend to make more videos like this in the future. If you did listen all the way through this, thank you, and I hope this was meaningful to you in some capacity, and there will be more like it coming in the future. And also, obviously, this channel has, I think, at this time, 2 subscribers, and so if you want to talk to someone about this, just definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to have a chat or have an email about this. And anyway, until next time, yeah, peace, fam.